Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. My name is Katie Nichols, and I'm so glad you're able to join us today. Hopefully everyone is having a great week. Our webcast topic today is talking about adversary trends. So in a few moments, I'll be joined by Saher Naumaan from BAE Systems to dive into our topic a little bit more. In terms of logistics, yes, this is being recorded, so no worries there. We'll also have a PDF of most of these slides available for you on the page where you registered. So let's dive right into our webcast for today. In case this is your first time joining the STAR webcast, here's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to bring you different voices and folks from around the community, giving you the inside scoop on what you need to know about cyber threats. So we've covered different sectors in the past, we've covered different topics. Today we're going to be diving into how do we track adversaries, why do we even bother doing that? And we'll be taking a look at a topic we've covered in a past webcast on how adversaries have responded to the coronavirus pandemic. We're looking at that from a slightly different perspective. And of course, our goal for you is to be able to leave the webcast with ideas on how to take action to better defend and do analysis in your own teams. So that is why we are here today. Our agenda. Those of you who've joined us before know that we like to give you a quick rundown of some things that have been happening in the news in terms of threat analysis and intelligence. Then we'll do a deep dive into our topic and then wrap up with some takeaways for you. So let's kick things off with a rundown. As always, quite a bit going on in the news. There were even a few things that dropped earlier today. I didn't have time to get onto the slide. First one, top story from this morning that you might have seen, there was an interesting article out of the Washington Post talking about an internal report from the CIA on some different security issues that possibly resulted in the Vault 7 leaks, if you remember those previously. A bunch of sensitive information leaked out from the CIA. So an interesting article I'd definitely recommend checking out from the Washington Post. Also Thomas Rid, who's sort of noted expert on disinformation and lots of different cybersecurity topics. I linked in the references at the end of the slides an interesting tweet stream from him commenting on that report. So I think more information is coming out about that now. There's a letter from a congressman on this, so definitely worth checking out and thinking about if you're reflecting on your own security teams. I've found that sometimes those of us in cybersecurity are often the worst about making sure our systems are patched or doing two-factor authentication. So whenever we're reading one of those reports, I think it's a good time to reflect on our own security practices, not just those of others. Next item, ransomware. I feel like each one of these, every month, I'm just giving updates on different ransomware families. And ransomware continues to be something that everyone is struggling with. A couple interesting links that I have at the end of the slides. There's a new ransomware family called Tycoon that, interestingly enough, was written in Java, targeting education victims, a bunch of others. Another ransomware family, Hackbit, that Carbon Black TAU did a deep dive into. There's also an interesting article, Krebs on security. So Brian Krebs had notified this small town in Alabama that they were potentially infected with ransomware. They didn't take action, and 12 days later, they actually got ransomed. So this is something that if your organizations have not thought through, how would you react in terms of a ransomware incident? You've got to do that. It's not optional anymore. And this is one thing where I think folks who are tracking threats, doing the analysis of what threats we see every day, there's a lot of evidence right now in open source reporting about how prevalent ransomware is. So if your organizations are taking it seriously, take some of these many reports about ransomware to your leadership and make sure you know how you'd respond if you were affected by ransomware. Other interesting things going on. There's a tweet out from the head of Google's threat analysis group, Shane Huntley, who referred sort of generally to the fact that a suspected Iranian group and a suspected Chinese group, APT31 on the Chinese side and APT35 on the Iranian side, were targeting presidential campaigns. And it's interesting because this is something that I think we all sort of assume is happening. 2016 election, that happened. 2020 election, we suspect a lot of adversaries are going after that campaign, those campaigns and that campaign staff, but it's sort of interesting to get some confirmation from a team who has a lot of visibility on what they're seeing. And saw someone from Microsoft also giving a +1 that they also saw some activity from a similar group they're tracking. So again, links to those in the references at the end of these slides. But something that I think we're gonna have to be keeping an increasing eye on over the next couple months as we ramp up to those November elections. Another interesting report that you might have noticed, NSA actually came out with a report on a suspected Russian group, Sandworm, exploiting a flaw in XM, which is a mail transfer agent really common in Unix systems. So sort of interesting to read that report because they talked about how Sandworm had been exploiting that vulnerability since 2019, which always leads me to think, okay, well, why now? Why did they release this report now? You know, also why NSA and why not DHS or another part of the US government releasing that report? So interesting things to think about. Is there some kind of messaging there? Why now are they releasing this when it's been going on since 2019? So another report I'd highly recommend taking a look at if you haven't already. That's just a rundown of some of the key things I've seen in terms of threat news. Of course, can't possibly cover everything that's going on, but there are a few key ones, and there's another big one, I think Operation Secondary Infection, another disinformation campaign just released today. So lots of things going on as always. So moving on to our deep dive topic of the day. Today we're talking about adversary trends, and we're gonna do things a little bit differently. Sometimes I'll turn it right over to our speaker for the day, but today I wanted to kind of frame up the topic a little bit and then turn it over to Saher to dive in with some examples from her team. So a good question to start with is, okay, we're talking about adversary trends and why we track them. Well, what's the point? Why do we bother tracking trends, either over time or in frequency of doing certain things? I think this, goes back somewhat to the whole point of doing cyber threat intelligence. And I see that as trying to gain a decision advantage, trying to inform our defenders and our decision makers, whoever you're informing on your teams. So key reasons to do this. Well, if you're tracking trends over time, you can try to see, okay, are there certain times of the year or times of the day when adversaries have been more or less active? And of course, past behavior isn't always indicative of future behavior, but it's a good place to start if you're trying to anticipate what adversaries might do next. You'll notice that I like the word anticipate. There's a whole field of anticipatory intelligence, and I highly prefer the word anticipate over predict. Because to me, predict is sort of like fortune telling, which as threat intelligence analysts, we can't really do that. But anticipating future behavior based on past trends, something that can help defenders better figure out how we should allocate resources. Are there times of the day or the year that we should maybe be more or less prepared? Another key reason to try to track trending in adversaries is to prioritize. This is so much of what threat intelligence is all about, that there are tons of different threats out there, and how do you prioritize the ones that matter the most to you? Well, if you're trending on adversaries over time, seeing which ones are maybe targeting you or your industry the most, that helps you prioritize which threats you should be focusing on. And of course, the name of the game here is all about informing your defenders, your decision makers, or whoever your intelligence team is reporting to. Or maybe if you don't have an intelligence team, just defenders who are reading open source reporting. But all about knowing what adversaries are up to help you drive better decision making. Now, in thinking about adversary trends, it's good to consider what things might influence adversaries to trend in a certain way or another way. And it's interesting because I think we have this idea sometimes that we talk about the APT or the adversary. Well, adversaries are human too. And so many of the same things that would change your daily work schedule or your behaviors, those might be some of the same influences on adversaries. And I say that, well, we also have to be cautious of mirror imaging, thinking that adversaries are just like us. They are like us, and that adversaries are human too. So some of the key things that I've seen over the years when I've been tracking adversaries, and that many other analysts in this community will track, holidays are a big one. You might notice, and Saher will talk about some examples of potential activity changes due to holidays. And that might be, adversaries are taking time off, so you see gaps in activity. That's one that I've seen across many years. There's an interesting calendar from CrowdStrike, actually, that if you've gotten their calendar before, they have holidays from around the world, which can be interesting to take a look at. Different global events. Of course, coronavirus, COVID-19 is a huge global event, but you'll also see sometimes adversaries will change up because of any major global event, something in the news. They'll change up their themes, especially in phishing, to try to take advantage of that, try to take advantage of people being interested in a certain topic. So while a global pandemic is kind of new for our generation, the idea that adversaries are using global events in their topics and their themes, that's not really a new concept for us as threat analysts. Other things to think about, influences on adversaries, new jobs. There have been times where it seems like, one group that we've been tracking acts a lot like another group all of a sudden, and it seems kind of strange. And then you realize, well, ultimately, maybe it's just someone got a new job, a developer from one team moved to a different team and they took their malware or their coding abilities with them. So that could be one influence. Also, new bosses. Adversaries have bosses too. So sometimes a new boss comes in, has different priorities. And priorities, that term of art for that, I would say, is requirements. Adversaries have needs of who are they trying to go after? Who are they trying to target? What kind of information are they trying to collect? And those are their requirements. And so you'll often see, maybe at a micro level on a team with a new boss, or at a macro level, an entire country or maybe a hacktivist group will decide, well, we have different priorities, different requirements, and you might see adversaries shift targeting of a different industry, different types of victims they're going after. Now, a lot of times it can be really tough to get a glimpse into these kind of influences, and Saher is going to give us some examples of how you could find some of these. But think about, things like holidays. You can look up global holidays. That's not something too difficult to do. Things like a person on a adversary team changing jobs, that might be difficult unless you have a unique collection. But things like requirements or national priorities, there are even open source documents like China's 5-year plan, or even the United States releases a national security strategy. Those things can give us some sense of what an adversary's priorities are in terms of their requirements. So be thinking about how you can get glimpses into each of these things, these possible influences on adversaries. Another key question as we talk about trending is, well, what exactly should we trend on? And my favorite answer to almost any question is, well, it depends. And it depends on both what data you have to be able to do trending, as well as your requirements. What are the problems you're trying to solve by tracking adversaries over time and what their trends are? So some common things that I've seen analysts trend on, targeting patterns in terms of your organization, your entire industry, or maybe just more broadly. So looking at, maybe per month, is a certain group, targeting you more or less? If you have peer organizations that you're talking to, other security operations centers in your industry, maybe you're part of an ISAC or an ISAO, looking at, well, are adversaries targeting your industry a lot, or have they backed off? And comparing that to maybe other industries, other victims. Infrastructure can also be a really interesting thing to trend off of, and Saher will have some examples of that, registering new infrastructure. Is that happening at a certain time of the month, time of the year, or even time of the day? Or if there's known infrastructure, certain IP addresses or domain names that you're tracking, how do adversaries switch up using those? Do they come back to old ones? Or are they using a new infrastructure? Another one to talk about, using certain tactics, techniques, or procedures. And this is one where, talking about my own team, I work at Red Canary as an intelligence analyst, and we have a lot of endpoint focused data. And so for us, it makes a lot of sense to trend on techniques. That's the data we have in terms of endpoints. So we see a lot of those adversary TTPs, and for us, trending on those top ones helps us figure out, okay, where should we prioritize our efforts? For the customer or the public who we share that information with, what should they focus on in terms of top techniques adversaries are using? So that's just an example of not just using the data we have in terms of endpoint telemetry, but fulfills our requirements to try to identify what common techniques adversaries are using and figure out how do we respond to those better. Another common trending point is on different attributes of malware. So there's somewhat of a debate in the community, how useful are things like compile times for malware? or other timing. If you see use of infrastructure during work hours that are common in a certain country, is that useful? Is that not useful? It kind of depends, and we'll talk about that a little bit throughout our conversation. So these are some of the key things that analysts often will trend on as they're tracking adversaries. Now, as I kind of have alluded to so far, and we'll dive into much more, this is not an easy thing to do. Trying to trend consistently and try to make assessments about what influences adversaries are being affected by. One of the key challenges here is making sure that your data is consistent. And this is where, having, some kind of structured format or framework that you use, like my team uses MITRE ATT&CK as a framework. And so we map detections we see to different techniques. And that's important because if you have data that's structured the same way, it's much easier for you to be able to trend over time. If it was all over the place and we were just recording notes about different behaviors, TTPs, much tougher to trend. So not just choosing some kind of set structure, whether it's attack or something like Varus to record your incidents, or mapping to the diamond model or the kill chain, or anything else that you choose in your teams, making sure you have a structure that you map to, that everyone maps the same way, and just making sure that your data continues to come in the same way. If a certain feed or source goes down, that can really affect your ability to trend. So that's one challenge there. Another key challenge, it's tough for all of us, making sure that we remember that, sure, if we're doing trending based on certain attributes, we can do that, but we don't have all the visibility on what adversaries are doing everywhere. Each one of us just has certain visibility in our organization or maybe our sector on what adversaries are doing. So it can be tough to realize that, okay, none of us are perfect, none of us have perfect visibility, but you can still try to look for these adversary trends and patterns despite that. Another key challenge, the deception question. Are adversaries trying to deceive us? Are they trying to plant any false flags, or make us think that they're working different hours or changing up their compile times? That's really tough. And the challenge is that adversaries always could be trying to conduct some kind of disinformation operations, but maybe they aren't always. So always in the back of our mind, we want to be thinking, is there some kind of deception aspect here, while still trying to look for patterns and trends and realizing that adversaries aren't always conducting disinformation or deception operations. The other challenge here, last one bullet on the slide, understanding what's really the root cause behind any changes we see or trends we see. If we see adversaries operating a certain month, they've increased their activity. Well, is it because they've increased targeting of our organization, or is it because our visibility has changed? We've gotten more data. Is it, because of a certain holiday or major event in the world that an adversary has gone silent for a month, or is it something else going on? And understanding that root cause can be really, really tough. And as we do that, we have to be particularly careful of cognitive biases that affect us all. So the one, I have terrible Latin, but cum hoc ergo propter hoc, that's the one known as correlation is not causation. So just remember that just because there's a gap for a month and there happened to be a holiday, doesn't necessarily mean that the holiday caused that gap. There might be some kind of correlation there, but that doesn't mean it's a causal relationship. The other key bias to watch out for is mirror imaging. This idea that, yes, adversaries are human like us, but it can be tough to get your head around the fact that they might operate a little bit differently, different cultural priorities, different approaches to a problem. Adversaries aren't necessarily going to behave in the way that we would want them to behave. So those are a couple key challenges as you're trying to do trending. So what some of you have already discovered, there is a questions panel in GoToWebinar. So feel free, if you have questions at any point, feel free to type those in. Got one question coming in so far. What topics do I have to learn about first to start in the threat hunting world? Great question. So whether you're talking about threat hunting or threat intelligence, I get this one a lot. How do you get started? And I think for everyone, kind of having some fundamental understanding of how do networks work, how do operating systems work, how does DNS work, how do IPs resolve, network flow, that kind of thing. those basics can be really helpful, because otherwise it's tough for you to understand the different collection sources, or why do I even bother looking at malware? So some basic technical skills, but from there, I think the most important thing to develop is just a sense of curiosity. That you try to investigate one thing and you see an anomaly or you see a pattern, and trying to investigate, what does that mean? Creating a hypothesis, whether you're doing threat hunting or threat intelligence. So good question there to kick off the question section. So yeah, if you have questions, feel free to drop those in at any point and we will address them. All right, so that's sort of the framing of the issue, and I wanted to look at more broadly thinking about adversary trends and this challenges that we have in tracking those trends, as well as some key things that we trend on. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Saher, and she's going to dive into specifically looking at some potentially state-sponsored groups, how they've changed their behaviors a little bit, how her team has tracked trending over time, especially considering the recent global pandemic. So Saher, I'll send it on over to you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Katie and Sans for having me on the webcast this month. I think Katie brought up some excellent points that I'm going to talk about in my slides, and many of them relate to things like caveats and the challenges that we discussed. So I'll be looking at a few different groups that my team tracks, and some of the biggest things that have come up have been, is our data consistent? What measures are we using to track these actors? From the data, what kind of insights can we get, while at the same time recognizing that there are several unknowns, and as Katie said, correlation does not equal causation. So this is just, kind of a caveat for the whole presentation, which is that this is based on my team's data and our work and what we can see, and maybe particular conclusions that we might be able to draw from the data that we've observed from these actors. So we've talked a lot about how COVID-19 has affected everything, organizations, having a major impact on resource management, personnel safety, remote working environments, network defenses, those kind of things. And threat actors have also capitalized on this crisis, which has been mentioned as well, using topical lures for fishes to target organizations. So we wanted to take a little bit of a different look at how the pandemic has affected threat actors, and more in terms of their operations. And we think about how they're also humans, they have bosses, and they have structure to their day maybe. How do their operations work? Has there been any change based on potential quarantining or isolation? So those are some of the things we're going to look at. I've looked at, I think, 5 different groups and kind of their response potentially to the pandemic, and we're using different measures for each of them. So based on how my team best tracks each actor, we're using a different measure to see if there was kind of any interruption in their activity. So I tried to choose the actors that we have a decent visibility on and can see kind of consistent patterns of activity, so that if there was a disruption, we would notice it more easily, and that might be more significant. So let me start off. The first actor we will take a look at is Lazarus, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Lazarus is a North Korean state-sponsored adversary that we've been tracking for many years, most famously known probably for the Bangladesh bank heist, probably 4 years ago now. So this is a group that's very active. You'll see kind of the targeting range from financial organizations, mostly banks. They're into some cryptocurrency targeting, and there's some other interests as well. And this is kind of mainly centered around the financial heists in terms of how we track the group. But basically, we keep a close eye on them, and over the period of months, basically in 2020, we were looking at, okay, have we seen any kind of disruption here? Has any of the activity changed? And interestingly, as we were observing activity in 2020, we noticed that there hadn't really been a bank heist or a cash out in a few months until recently. Sometimes we can't tell what the reason is for carrying out fewer heists. That's something that we wouldn't necessarily have visibility on. But even though there was no heist, there were still activity, there were intrusions, the group was continuing to register domains around the world. So you can see in the graph that we look at domain registrations and our initial discovery of the IPs. So the caveats here being, we are measuring the number of domain registrations and IP discovery dates per week. Obviously, our first seen dates don't necessarily match with when the IPs first appeared, but based on our previous tracking, roughly these dates are probably pretty close. So another caveat to this, generally is the context matters. So this is the data as we saw it, but the context is important, and using kind of multiple and overlapping measures to have higher confidence and verify your data is really important. So kind of a little bit of background to this activity. We see that through the months of March and April, there wasn't really a break. That was pretty consistent infrastructure creation. The COVID outbreak was at the end of January, and that's kind of when North Korea was experiencing it as well. The persistence of infrastructure creation in the peak months kind of shows there wasn't any interruption. You see a little bit of a gap at the end of January. It's possible that that was related to COVID. During the same time period, other measures that we use to track Lazarus, like malware, you can see lots of uploads from Lazarus of their most recent malware beefeater, and showing early compile times, which again have to be verified and make sure that they're not spoofed. But you can see those are in early March. And the functionality and kind of active use of the malware was showing that they're still working on it, it's still developing, so it looks like there hasn't been much disruption. So the other thing is, even looking beyond Lazarus activity, if you kind of see what North Korea is doing in that context, we've seen, some research that, there was a major drop in illicit North Korean shipping activity in February 2020. So while, as COVID spread and kind of halted some of those kind of operations, more physical operations. So resource shipments to China decreased as North Korea called back its shipping fleet, and the vessels kind of had to stay stationary in North Korean ports. So you think, why does that matter? Well, one of the big reasons that Lazarus does these financial heists is because they face, a lot of sanctions, and they have limited sources of revenue, and so they need to develop alternate sources to, finance whatever operations they do have. So this includes financial heists, cryptocurrency targeting, many others, things like illicit weapons proliferation, etc. So maybe that the resource shipments being constrained, things like that they export like coal, that might have been a disruption to their financial flow, and so maybe the increase or the continued activity and the intrusions that we see in terms of their cyber operations is kind of making up for that. So we've seen that targeting banks and doing SWIFT-related cash outs and cryptocurrency targeting has been, a primary source of income for them, millions and millions of dollars. It's fully remote, it's convenient, and so you can tell from the, ongoing intrusions that that's something that they're putting a lot of effort into, and clearly isn't as easily disrupted potentially as other operations that they have in other areas. So that's one example.
So jumping in, quick question. So you mentioned, something like, okay, the gap in, weeks 5 through 6, was possibly related to the pandemic outbreak. Could you talk a little bit about how does your team make assessments like that? Possible is, what we call a word of uncertainty. How do you take evidence and try to convey that to, folks who are reading your reports? How do you try to convey that uncertainty to them, and, realizing that we don't know for sure? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So it is really about laying out what the data you have is and being clear, that you aren't jumping to conclusions. So as you said, using estimative language is really important. In this case, I don't think there's really, a way to measure a specific kind of, higher or lower confidence that we're in terms of what we see. I definitely don't like to make kind of sweeping statements. So I definitely make sure to caveat these things. It's, when you have so many variables at play, especially when you can't see all of them, it's obviously difficult to make those kind of decisions about, or kind of conclusions. So we try to make sure that it's, explaining the context and maybe pointing out a number of possibilities or the ones that we can come up with, and just making sure that our data can be backed up and there's evidence for our potential hypothesis, and then acknowledging that there are other options, because short of asking the adversaries and having them explain exactly what the reasons were for their activity, no one will be able to actually prove that beyond doubt. So I think, yeah, the context is important, and then many layers of overlapping evidence should kind of help you get to that.
You hit on something that I think so many people overlook, but explaining, like, okay, here's our assessment, and then here's the evidence that we have to back that up. Like, whether you're in like threat intelligence or not, I think that's a good practice to be in. So I'm glad you mentioned that, and also, acknowledging that there are other like assessments or other hypotheses that you maybe have considered and why those are less likely than the one you chose. So.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that, sometimes when when I'm writing a report or giving my explanation, it might seem obvious and you might make assumptions, and, write something that you assume that, or maybe not write something that you assume everybody would know, but you have to think about it from, somebody else's perspective. And if they're seeing that for the first time or are unfamiliar, or, you need to walk someone through it, you have to realize that they might not have the same understanding. And so you do have to explain. And obviously assumptions can be very dangerous. So yeah, I think it's definitely a matter of having kind of a more distanced view, and then peer review, always very helpful to catch those things when you make those mistakes potentially, or make those assumptions, and somebody can point out and say, oh, I don't understand how you got from this piece of evidence to this conclusion, and if there are logical leaps that you're making.
Yeah, having teammates to point out those things can be incredibly helpful. The other question I had on this slide, and brace yourself for this one. So the term Lazarus group, as you might be aware, this has sort of become like a massive bucket for anything North Korea over time. Some people will track like smaller clusters like Blue Neuroth. Mm-hmm. What made your team decide to track Lazarus overall as sort of like an umbrella of lots of different types of North Korean activity?
Yeah, so I do get that this is an issue, and of course it's not the only group or country kind of that we have this issue with, and everybody tracks differently. Part of it sometimes depends on visibility and what activity you can see, and maybe you can't see the link to other teams or whatever it is. For us, it's we look at this as it's the same. We're looking at the same teams in the same organization. So the financial targeting, we won't necessarily separate groups just based on targeting. So, for example, the North Korean threats that have been targeting the nuclear power plants, like the one in India, I think last year maybe, or more defense-related organizations, we still consider that Lazarus too. We won't separate it just on the targeting. So I think it depends on how granular you go, I guess. But things like APT 37 and 38, which are both North Korean, for us that's the same, and we look at it as Lazarus. We don't see a reason to really change that. Yeah, I mean it's a judgment call, I guess, in terms of how things differ, targeting, TTPs, all this kind of stuff. But for us in this case, I think we kind of keep it because we think it's the same operators, and that's the same kind of operation that they're doing with similar. Yeah.
Thanks for answering that one. No, I mean, and that's the challenge with this is so many people struggle with the different names, but I think what you said was so important. Like for our team, like the visibility we have and what we're trying to do, it makes sense to just group it all under one group. So that's totally legit. Other teams, if they care more about dividing out types of targeting, or they don't care as much as about the adversary, like behind the keyboard, maybe they would divide it out. So thanks for clarifying that. I appreciate it.
No worries. All right, so moving on to our next actor. So Emissary Panda some might know as APT27. I think previously it's been reported as Lucky Mouse. This is a Chinese group that's been around for a decade at least, and we've seen some prolific activity from them in the last couple years. And mostly this is all focused on espionage, but they've been kind of global in terms of their targeting. And one of the things we looked at here for the measures, I will say that upstream infrastructure is your friend. And if you can get visibility of that, it can show you a lot. So, we've seen Emissary Panda campaigns, with consistent activity with recon, scanning, intrusions, infrastructure creation, and this is basically a graph of the VPN infrastructure setup over recent months, so the end of 2019 into 2020. And what you can notice is that it was mostly continuous, aside from a month-long gap that started at the end of January and lasting for most of February. So again, we're looking at the data as we saw it. We have pretty good visibility of this group and kind of, I would say, like pretty extensive visibility, I guess, and have been tracking pretty closely as well. So the usual trend of Emissary Pandas creating VPN infrastructure was pretty regularly timed. The nodes would appear at least every 2 weeks. And so you kind of see that there's a bit of a slowdown at the end of, at the end of January to towards the end of February. And it didn't stop altogether. But so that's an important note. Obviously, it doesn't mean that actors went silent or they went dead, but it's possible that they kind of decreased operations. Maybe there wasn't as much access. There was still administration kind of activity. So again, as you go upstream, you can kind of go from the command and control nodes, you can go through the VPN layers, and you can get to these admin nodes. So if you can see that, it's pretty as close to the operators as you're going to get. So based on previous patterns, we would have expected there to be at least another set of infrastructure created during that gap. But after that, the group seems to have continued on with its old infrastructure, maybe at a reduced rate. They could have been just preoccupied or constrained. So I'll point out that Chinese New Year was also around the same time, which again, it's especially when you have these kind of multiple factors at play, it's difficult to say whether they were on holiday or maybe they were in quarantine. It's really not clear. It's just what the observables are showing us. So that might have been coinciding basically, and usually if you've been looking at Chinese actors and have studied them, you'll know that they do tend to take a break around Chinese New Year. It does happen that there's kind of a holiday time off, but it could have extended into the outbreak period for COVID, which might explain the quiet month of February. So kind of in terms of the spread of the pandemic in China, it had made its way around all the provinces and the mainland pretty quickly. So there were a lot of quarantines and isolation measures. If we can pinpoint, if we know, for example, where Emissary Panda is likely located, where the operators are, it's possible to look at that province or city and say, okay, based on the health measures and the kind of defensive measures that were put in place to stop the spread of the pandemic, did that change maybe the operators' activity as well? And when they loosened restrictions, could they have returned to normalized operations and set up VPN command and control infrastructure at similar rates to those that we've previously seen? So one of the things that's worth pointing out is with the consistency or not consistency of activity, there are things you can think about in terms of how the teams are structured. It might give you insight into, say, can they also work remotely pretty easily from home? Is it something where they need to be in the office for access to infrastructure or machines, whatever it is? Are they more centralized? Do they not have that kind of fluidity or loosened possibility of working remotely? And that's the same as us. There's some people who can work from home without having any disruption in their work, and there's others who are bound to the office for other reasons. So that can kind of maybe provide some interesting points to study in terms of maybe how the group is structured and how they operate.
So in terms of looking at VPN nodes, you talked about the importance of kind of going upstream. So virtual private networks being sort of a way that adversaries can try to add another layer of kind of hiding where they're coming from. Is that right? Could you talk a little bit about not revealing any secret sauce, but how could you track these VPN nodes? Do you have specific like commercial collection, or can you do that through open source? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so it'll definitely, as with everything, be a combination of things. But tracking this group uses multiple layers. So if you start from, say if you can identify victims, you can move to what command and control nodes that they might be communicating with, and then on top of that, you have a couple layers of VPN infrastructure, and then on top of that, maybe you have the admin node. So it's basically about finding the patterns and commonality. So in terms of can you see what do you have access to, what commercial tools do you have access to NetFlow data, do you have access to other tools that would give you that. But there is it's not something necessarily that you could find just based on open source. You might need commercial tools, but looking at shared certs or kind of other things that overlap, and then when you correlate them, maybe this one IP appears again and again, and it connects to multiple CNCs. So you can start to identify from there, okay, what IPs are connecting to that particular node, and then you can work your way up basically. So it's just about finding where you see the same data point over and over, and is that one of the ones that connects the other ones. I know that sounds kind of vague, but it's basically mapping out a network.
Yeah, I think so much of this field, doing threat analysis is really looking for patterns, and then having the ability to not just say, okay, it's a pattern, like, is it a meaningful pattern?
Mm-hmm,
what is
exactly.
it telling me? And I always say, this art of pivoting through things, it's more of an art than a science. So you can't say absolutely, okay, if you do this pivot, it will definitely be related. But I appreciate you giving me a high level overview of how you go about thinking through identifying these VPN nodes.
No, I think that's very true. It comes with practice. There's never, you're never pivoting on the same thing every time, and different actors will have different kind of weak points that you can use. So I think it just becomes about experience and what you see constantly, and kind of repetitive, and potentially that can lead you to places with significant conclusions. So we will move on to the next one. So Kacheng is another Chinese espionage actor that you might be familiar with, again, having operated for probably a decade now. Also, you'll see we used VPN nodes to look at this actor as well. So they also have a pretty distinct visible pattern of infrastructure creation. When we've previously looked at the activity, they were operating over 130 VPN nodes, I think. So, and each of those was used to contact one CNC node, usually only for a single day. So that's pretty distinctive. You don't see maybe other actors doing that kind of or having that kind of pattern. So you can see a lower level of activity over the New Year period, Chinese New Year, and then the outbreak. Again, followed by the possibility that it might be a holiday break or impact from the pandemic. So from mid-February into March and April, they can kind of be seen escalating operations with more and more VPN nodes, which shows an increase in the admin activity. Now, this is also, kind of exactly the possibility that you mentioned before. So it's possible that they came back in full force and they were all rested up from their quarantine and isolation. At the same time, it definitely could have been that we had an increased visibility over those weeks as well. So, they could have gotten more aggressive, had additional tasking, but it's also that maybe we started to track them better suddenly. It could be both. That's kind of where you get into more hazy areas as well, where you can't really, again, determine root cause. And so that's just kind of the visibility that we saw of that particular group. So moving on to a different part of the world, this is also a little bit of a different measure that we took with Muddy Water. So Muddy Water is an Iranian espionage group that's relatively new compared to the other ones, probably 2017 it appeared. And so for this group, we looked at malware uploads and compiled and modified dates for the samples. So this is obviously a tricky measure to look at, because you definitely can't be sure that it's the compile times or the modified times are accurate, but also a malware sample upload, what does that really mean? Is that indicative of potentially when the victim found it or when the actors were testing it? It's very unclear. So definitely you have to keep those things in mind when you kind of make those, when you do the analysis for this kind of activity. So they seem to have a little bit of a different effect from the pandemic than the Chinese groups. So Muddy Water, again, using one that has kind of prolific campaigns and very continuous operations, it's easier to see if there was a gap. So you'd see malware samples appearing pretty frequently in online repositories. And so we looked at either when the samples were uploaded, and then if there was a compile time or date modified time that we could verify, then we use those for a little bit more accuracy. But basically, if when we look at the malware sample uploads and compile times, you can see that the activity dropped off at the end of February and returned towards the end of March. So Iran reported its infections obviously later than China, and so that was in mid to late February, and the virus quickly spread. So funnily enough, they also had a holiday period and had Nowruz, which is Persian New Year, in the middle of that mess. So again, the kind of pinpointing exactly what the reason was for the gap is still difficult, and it's possible that the gap might explain that the operational structure of the group means they can't work from home. The infrastructure and office access is necessary for the campaigns. They may have had to pause and return when restrictions were lifted in later in March and beginning of April, and it might be because the team is more decentralized and has been able to operate or can't operate without that disruption. So again, there's definitely some caveats here. It's not always immediately accurate in terms of, this malware sample was uploaded. Does this mean there was a victim that was targeted, or does this mean that the malware authors are working on new samples and things like that? So just another measure, and again, from a group that had pretty consistent activity, so we would be able to discern whether there was a difference.
So I guess one question, in Muddy Water or other Iranian groups, have you seen a drop off around Nowruz in previous years? If you've been tracking back that far?
Yeah, I think we have seen that with other groups. It tends to be a few days, and usually you can kind of tell that it's a brief pause. And again, it might not mean much in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I think it's pretty similar to Chinese New Year, that you can tell that the actors maybe have a little bit of a holiday.
And so this graph shows kind of breakdown by week. I was curious your thoughts on like time of day. I mentioned that earlier. I've seen a lot of analysts look at like compile times of malware being during working hours in a certain country. Like I've seen that for APT10. I think PwC did analysis on that years ago. That's often kind of a controversial thing to think about because, of course, adversaries could always change up their hours. I was curious if your team has seen anything like that, like clustering around working hours in terms of compile times or any kind of other timing.
Yeah, I think for some groups we have, probably not for most. I think, again, it's really important that you have a big enough set of data to work with, because otherwise, if you don't, you can't really see the pattern, and so it will seem like one-offs, or maybe you're drawing conclusions from too limited a set, and maybe you're jumping the gun a bit. So I think, yeah, definitely collecting enough data to make those kind of calls is definitely important. And I know that we couldn't do it for every single actor. So I think it definitely depends. But yeah, time of day has been a factor, but just one thing that I would note is that, like with everything else, it's never the silver bullet, right? So that'll always be used in parallel with other measures and say, okay, are there other things that correlate that, that particular insight?
That's such a great point in terms of the number of data points. Like if I have 3 data points on compile times and they all happen to be in the same time zone, like, that's kind of weak. So looking for other things or more data. So we had a question come in, and maybe you could speak to this in terms of, how your team collects and stores this data. So asking, how do you do the collection of data like compile or modified time on malware samples? Do you do that automatically? How do you kind of store that in a central database? Could you talk at all about that?
Yeah, vaguely. We do have kind of a platform of tools that our devs have to develop for, use by the analysts. So it looks at what the analyst needs are, discusses with the team, and says, okay, what would make your, workflow faster or more convenient, or give you better insights, right? So you know, some of this stuff we can ingest and automate. Other stuff you do have to do manually. We, you know, like every other team, we'll look at virus total and see you have your YAR rules, see you know, when there are hits, and then you go kind of analyze the samples. But I would say it's a mix of things. In this case, you know, we don't necessarily store everything. We try to collect based on each actor, depending on what's important. But yeah, I think something like compile times you do have to go and do manually, because often they can be misleading. So that's a little bit tricky, and it requires kind of a human analyst to go and confirm.
Yeah, I love what you said about, like, we have a platform that we do this in, and the way that we designed that was based on what we were trying to do with it and the type of data we were trying to store. I think that's so important, and so many people will start with something like a threat intelligence platform and not really know what data they want to store. So having a clear understanding of, okay, what do I want to try to store? What questions do I want to ask of the data? That's awesome that your team is thinking about that, because I think it differs between different teams. And I would just, you know, give a +1 to what you said about, like, for compile times of malware, that's often something, you know, an analyst is going to have to validate. So I think the key is trying to figure out, you know, what of your tools can you start to automate, pulling that information in. Maybe you automate, like, with the virus total API into your threat intelligence platform, but then ultimately a lot of the analysis that you're talking about, that we're talking about today, requires some kind of human vetting. Like, so maybe a machine brings it in on automatically, and then a human confirms, like, is this a meaningful data point or not? So I have to find a mix, like you said, like a mix of some automation plus some human vetting to make sure your data is actually well backed up and well structured.
Yeah, and I think the, you know, kind of platform of tools that we use internally for the analysts, it's good to note that, you know, that's always in development, and it's still always undergoing changes, and we put in requests and things for new features, and so it's something that develops with the team. So you know, maybe find something that's more significant, and maybe you need that, and it's hasn't been represented in your workflow or platform before, but now it has. So it's something that kind of is dynamic as the team becomes better at, you know, tracking and doing their and hunting and doing their threat intel work.
Yeah, great point. Should always be kind of modifying your tools and your workflows. And I've found the more advanced teams who have a lot of collection will often have, like, a dedicated developer who's, you know, taking those feature requests and kind of updating their tools and your workflow.
Yeah, so the last one really quickly, I will go over, and we didn't use a graph for this one, but one thing that was interesting to note that was different from the others. So Charm and Kitten is another Iranian group that's espionage focused around the world, really focuses on the major phishing campaigns and credential harvesting. You don't see too much malware associated with them. There's always pretty, you know, vast infrastructure that they use, and usually they have maybe a regular pattern of infrastructure registration. But in this case, I wasn't confident enough that we, you know, in the data that we had, or that there was enough of it. So I didn't necessarily want to show a graph that maybe didn't have enough represented to lead to any significant insights. But one thing that was interesting to note here was that we're pretty sure that Charm and Kitten continued uninterrupted, but the group has also kind of changed in terms of where it's directing its attention. So usually, you know, Charm and Kitten is going after dissidents, you know, other kind of a lot of different, you know, individuals, and has a particular maybe profile in terms of what organizations it would target. But you know, it's very much focused its attention, either redirected or, you know, added a kind of target profile into its existing one, which is that it's targeting organizations related to COVID-19 planning and research. So these are things like healthcare, pharmaceutical companies, the WHO, that kind of thing. And so there's been, you know, some public reporting around the fact that there has been Iranian adversaries targeting WHO with phishing emails, along with private sector, again, organizations like pharmaceutical companies that might be developing vaccines. So you can see some of the phishes shown there, and basically they've this has become a major part of their operation. Whether or not it's the entirety of it, unclear, but it's definitely shown that the tasking and interest has shifted. So this is obviously like many other intelligence agencies that are very interested in kind of what's happening in terms of pandemic. What is the research? What does the research look like? What is the vaccine look like? What are the numbers in terms of death rates and all that kind of stuff? So a lot of these organizations would have that data, so infection, death rates, other kind of maybe significant data. So it's kind of, this would be the case with any kind of international crisis. It's the topical thing. Everyone wants to have as much information about it as possible, and this is how you get it, is by doing this kind of espionage. So I think especially as Iran kind of battles its current circumstances with an overwhelming number of cases and deaths, maybe compared to other countries, every country is trying to develop a response plan and kind of a vaccine potentially, and so the leadership would be similarly interested in this kind of data. Just another thing to note is that there's other Iranian groups that I wouldn't have included in this, or didn't, because in terms of the operational tempo, it's maybe more volatile and difficult to get consistency on in terms of the data. So maybe a gap in that activity wouldn't be as significant, and you couldn't really draw insights from it either. And it would be difficult to know whether they've actually paused operations or they're quietly planning the next one. And so there's, that we would see maybe other instances where an Iranian group like APT33 has had a bit more of a clear response, which is that we haven't seen anything from them since the end of January. Pretty significant drop off. And again, based on our visibility, it could be that others are. But it's interesting that that group maybe still hasn't even returned even after a few months, unlike some of the others where they came back after a few weeks. So it's, definitely unclear what exactly they're doing, but that's kind of an opposite extreme to some of the other ones who have just kept going without much of a problem. So that kind of
concludes. I think you make a great point there in terms of, like, not everything is going to be useful to trend on. Like, if there's been nothing on APT33 for months, like, that's maybe not a useful point to trend on. So I imagine it's some, trial and error. Like Charming Kitten, I like that you don't have a graph because you didn't feel like there was enough data there. So sometimes, I think when you try to do this kind of trending, maybe you'll have dead ends, like graphs that are just boring, and then others, like the graphs you showed, that pretty compelling that something was going on that caused a gap. And of course, that's an assessment you make, but some kind of clear, stop or trends in the data. So I appreciate the restraint you have in not kind of making graphs just to make graphs. I like it.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. I get very concerned that we're presenting it in the best way and saying, okay, this is exactly where we stand in terms of the data and the evidence. And so, again, having the steps to justify it and say, yes, I can, back up this hypothesis with what we've observed from the activity. So, yep, definitely very careful analysis is what we try to do.
Awesome. That is a good attribute of any analyst, being honest about where your data is coming from and your gaps. Awesome. Thank you so much for all of that. I think we're almost at the top of the hour. Amazing how quickly it goes. We had a quick question that came in there as we were talking about threat intelligence platforms. So an example of a threat intelligence platform would be something like MISP, which is an open source one, MISP. But it sounds like Sahar's team uses kind of a custom built platform. Some people use commercial or open source threat intelligence platforms. Some people will build their own, but always good, as Sahar's team does, to look at what you're trying to store in that, what data you're trying to get out. All right, so with that, I don't see any other questions coming in. If you have any last questions, we'll see if we can get to those. But starting to wrap up, I want you to think about some of the things we talked about during this webinar and then go take action. So think about, for your teams, what could maybe you trend on? Do you have data about malware? Do you have data about infrastructure? Maybe you don't. Maybe you have data about techniques that adversaries are doing, like my team does. So think about what data you have, and then just start tracking it. Figure out some structured format whether you use an open source threat intelligence platform like MISP, or you use my favorite tool, Microsoft Excel. Start to track that data in a structured way and see what trends you find over time. I've given you lots of examples of things you can try trending over. Not every single one is going to have interesting results, as Saher gave some examples of. Some of them, you might not see something meaningful, but remembering that any kind of trending you do, you're going to have to make an assessment based on some evidence, and just remember the limitations, that none of us have all the data, none of us have perfect visibility on adversaries. So remember those limitations as you go about doing this trending. With that, references are here for you. We'll be posting a PDF of this part of the slides later on, so you can check out those references later on for your reading. And with that, that's all we have. Thank you so much to Saher for joining me today, sharing all of her team's wisdom. And you can get a recording of this as well as those slides at the link that you are registered for this on. With that, thank you all so much for spending time with us today. Please stay well, and we hope to see you next time.